be helpful to just make mention of before we jump in after both preparing this week and then also just questions or conversations that I had is I think it's helpful to just make a distinction between the particular area of vulnerability versus what Satan will actually use in his attempts to exploit that. And I guess what I'm trying to say is take ego as an example. I brought up very specifically the idea of I think I'm smarter than everybody else. I think I have a lot of ability in that respect. I don't necessarily need to listen to other people. That's true, but think about this. Ego can take a lot of different shapes. It can also be, I think I'm more attractive than other people. I think I'm stronger than other people. I think that I make more money, therefore I'm a better person. There's a lot of different areas where we can have inflated egos, and that may just be the area of vulnerability, but the things that Satan brings into our life to try to exploit that or test that are going to look very different depending on how that reflects in your life. So if you're somebody who thinks you're smarter than everybody else, the ways that Satan attempts to exploit that are going to look different than if you just think that you're stronger than everybody else. So I know that's kind of a basic example, but I think that's a helpful clarification. The second piece, we're going to see this today. And sorry, I meant to say you can turn to Matthew 4 is going to be the main text that we're going to be working out of. But the second clarification I think is helpful is that Satan, in relation to who he targets. So obviously I made mention of the fact that Satan will essentially target anybody. And especially I used the National Geographic example where he's looking for the weak people or the weak person among the flock that he can target. But I think it's worth mentioning he definitely does also target the strong. So we don't ever want to think because I'm a strong person, Satan's not after me. And the reason I'm bringing that up is Matthew 4, that is the story of Jesus's temptation. So that's the perfect example of the fact that Satan is not above targeting anybody. He will do his best to take out whoever it's possible for him to reach. My wife had brought up a good example of this yesterday when we were walking, similar to how an undercover detective, if they're trying to take down a criminal organization or a drug distribution ring, they're going to probably have to start pretty low on the totem pole and just target somebody and figure out who they got it from and then who that person got it from. And eventually they'll work their way up to the top. And those first couple people may be the easiest people to get a hold of. And the reason that they're getting a hold of those easy people is not because that's the end of the story. It's because that helps them take down the whole organization. So we want to think of Satan similarly, where though he may target any given person, the end goal is to take down God's churches. So he's going to do whatever he can to take out the little people so that he can turn them against the bigger group. And eventually the goal is he can take out somebody high enough on the totem pole that it crumbles things, or just being able to take out the church as a whole. So again, I think the important thing is there is just not to get confused at the idea that just because he's going to pick off people who are easy to pick off doesn't mean that he's not coming after everyone, especially if you contribute a lot of value or that you are, again, higher on the totem pole, so to speak. But with those couple of clarifications, let's go ahead and pray before we jump fully in. Father, thank you for another Sunday. We thank you always for your word, for the clarity and direction it gives us in our lives, and the way that studying it can bring out new truth and different things for us to put into practice in our lives. We thank you for, again, just that opportunity, and just pray for your blessing and ask for your help in keeping our minds focused and our hearts open to what your word has to say. Please also be with me filling in for Pastor, that my mind would be clear, that I would be precise in the way that I communicate about things, that it would ultimately be accurate and truthful, and just that if there is any error in what I say, that would also be brought to light, that it can be clarified and squashed quickly to not lead to confusion. We know that you are a God of clarity, not a God of confusion. So please be with us in our time here as well in that respect. And again, we just thank you for your word as we're about to open it up, and we lift it all up in your son's name. Amen. All right, so just a quick review from what we covered last week. So again, we're talking about Satan's playbook and the idea of, like 1 Peter 5:8 talks about, just that Satan is prowling around looking for individuals to devour. So like we talked about last week, though it's not an exhaustive list, his attacks usually take place through an attempt at exploiting six main, I did change this word just at least in my notes, six main vulnerabilities in your life. The first of which was ego. I kind of gave a recap of that just now, but just again, that idea of a little bit too high of a view of myself, overconfidence in my abilities. Satan's looking for those kinds of people because they're super easy to lead them into areas where they may not want to listen to other people. They may not want to do something that someone else is telling them to do because they think that they have a better way of doing it. So Satan loves people who are overinflated because they're a lot easier. The whole, pride comes before the fall. That destruction can be very great if somebody thinks very highly of themselves and then has to eat a piece of humble pie. Then that can be a very dramatic thing happening in somebody's life, and that can lead them. Again, the goal of Satan being to destroy our faith in God and our faith as a whole. So, again, number one was our ego. Two was our inevitable dependencies. And if you remembered that, I just brought that up in respect to the things in our lives that we come to depend on in some respect, even all the way down to I rely on my morning coffee to get me kind of awake and going in the morning. There's a level of dependency there that I've created because I've put a habit in place that I essentially need to sustain that habit in order for my day-to-day routine to be smooth. Helpful clarification here. I think it's really important to point out that the piece that's inevitable is that you'll have some level of dependency on some things. So the inevitable piece is just the fact that these areas will be in our life. Even if you're somebody who wakes up at 5 a.m. every single morning, goes to the gym, and you say stuff like, if I don't make it to the gym in the morning, the rest of my day is completely shot and I feel terrible. You've created some level of dependency on going to the gym at 5 a.m. That's not necessarily a bad thing. It just means that you are affected if that falls off the table, if your home gym burns down, if you lose your membership, whatever the case may be. So the reason I'm making that clarification is don't get confused that the inevitable dependencies are only things that we rely on to live, like water and food. These dependencies can really be anything that we put into our lives that we've self-created and put in place. And so that's, again, where, like I said last week, we want to be careful about what we choose to put in place. We have a ton of freedom and ability to choose things that we will be dependent on and things we won't be dependent on. Josh Winter brought up a great example earlier this week of your phones and social media. That's a great example of something that we have created by our culture a dependency on. But if you think about it, if you work a job, nobody's forcing you as part of your job to sign into TikTok and watch videos every morning. There's no necessary dependency on social media from that standpoint. It's self-created. And yet there are tons of people that if their phones drop into a lake or all of a sudden the internet goes down or that particular social media platform goes down, that their lives are seriously negatively affected. So again, when we think about inevitable dependencies, the point is just we have the freedom to create or not create a lot of those things, and we need to be careful in what we choose to do that with. Number 3 on our list was perception. This was another one that I think I made a little bit more confusing by bringing the whole idea of perception versus perspective in without actually really defining both of those. I'm not going to get super hung up on that. I think the thing that's helpful to just revisit is what you should have walked away from last week is that your perception is the way that you interpret stuff when it happens. And you can change that based on what you choose to believe. So that's the important piece. Don't get hung up on the perspective side of it. But a good example I thought of this morning, it's kind of outlandish, but I think it drives the point home. If you're a farmer out east, and for some reason you believe deeply in your heart that the temperature must get down to at least negative 30 degrees during the winter for any of your crops to grow, think about the way that that belief changes your perception of cold weather. The whole winter time, you're going to be glued to your phone looking for it to get colder and colder and colder, and you're going to be super excited about it. And when that negative 30-degree day finally comes, you're going to be out there in like shorts and a t-shirt running through your fields, like cheering because you're so excited that, okay, great, that means my crops will grow this year. That's what I'm talking about when I refer to perception. That's not something that everybody has, that they're going to run through the fields at negative 30 degrees and think that's a good thing. It's because of what you've chosen to believe or the way that you interpret things when they happen. And the power in that is that we can change that, and also that if those things are misconfigured or we have the wrong information, that makes it really easy for Satan to try to exploit that. Another clarification there, I think, I brought up the negative side, that your perception, the way that Satan may choose to try to exploit that is by, you think something's going to happen, he'll specifically try to make it not happen. But I think it's also helpful to say that there could be perception pieces that he actually tries to confirm, because maybe your perception is, I shouldn't really have to give up this much to live the Christian life. Well, then that means, good news for you, Satan's going to do all sorts of things to try to show you that the world doesn't require that. He's going to try to confirm your perception in that, or your view of that, in the hopes that eventually it will make you want to jump off the cliff and leave the church and say, I don't know why you guys are making it this hard, because it's not that hard. It doesn't need to be this hard. So that's essentially the review portion. Just, again, ego, dependencies, and perception. We're going to finish off with the last three out of Matthew 4 here. So turning now to Matthew 4, if you're not already there, starting in verse 1. It says, Jesus was led up by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. And after fasting 40 days and 40 nights, he was hungry. And the tempter came and said to him, if you are the Son of God, command these stones to become loaves of bread. But he answered, it is written, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God. Then the devil took him to the holy city and set him on the pinnacle of the temple, and said to him, if you are the Son of God, throw yourself down, for it is written, he will command his angels concerning you, and on their hands they will bear you up, lest you strike your foot against a stone. Jesus said to him, again, it is written, you shall not put the Lord your God to the test. Again, the devil took him to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their glory. And he said to them, all these I will give you if you will fall down and worship me. Then Jesus said to him, begone, Satan, for it is written, you shall worship the Lord your God, and him only shall you serve. Then the devil left him, and behold, angels came and were ministering to him. So these are the main verses we're going to work out of. And I think, I know I keep doing this, but I think another helpful distinction or thing to have in mind when we're going through these verses, maybe I'm the only one that did this, but I don't think I probably am. But I remember reading this as, I don't remember how old I was, but just younger. And until very recently, my perspective was kind of not taking scripture super seriously here. And what I mean by that is not like I didn't believe it happened, but that it almost seems a little silly the way that these tests are set up, because it seems so simple that Jesus would pass them. Because here's the first one. I don't think I had that. I understood the whole, well, you're hungry, you've been out in the wilderness for a while, but Jesus being up on the top of the temple and Satan's like, hey, jump off the temple. And I remember reading that and just being like, what incentive would there be for Jesus to do that? And on top of that, I had this picture in my head of like, Jesus is standing next to Satan, who's, looks like a serpent or, something crazy out of a sci-fi movie. And you would just think that Jesus would be like, dude, I don't know why you're really trying to do this. Like, I'm Jesus, you're Satan. Like, obviously I'm not going to listen to you and what you're telling me to do. And just taking these verses that's what I mean by not seriously, is not as if they didn't happen, but almost like it was just a formality that Jesus had to just be out there and be like, no, Satan, I'm not going to do that. Instead of the idea that there's actually something here that would have been enticing for any one of us in the same situation, and even Jesus in the same situation. So again, I think that's important to have that perspective coming in here, is we're not being told this because Satan and Jesus are out playing make-believe in the wilderness, and they're like, well, we have to do this to just say that it happened, essentially. So the fourth area that Satan will try to test for vulnerability is your insecurity, or insecurities. Maybe that would be a way to say it, but your insecurity. And that's just these first four verses. I'll just run through them one more time, or I should say verses 2 through 4. After fasting 40 days and 40 nights, he was hungry, and the tempter came and said to him, if you are the Son of God, command these stones to become loaves of bread. But he answered, it is written, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God. So what Satan is doing here is he is essentially testing Jesus's trust in God and God's ability to provide or willingness to provide. So again, we want to keep in mind this is not just Jesus is on vacation in the wilderness and so Satan's like, "Hey, why haven't you eaten anything yet?" This is verse 1, Jesus being led into the wilderness to be tempted. And then again, Satan coming in and saying, "If you're the son of God, command these stones to become loaves of bread." So, what Satan's looking for is some level of insecurity in Jesus, something that in Jesus would say, I don't know if I can trust God completely to provide for me. I've been out here for 40 days and 40 nights and I haven't eaten anything yet. And God has not, like for the Israelites, rained manna down for me yet. And there's no indication that that's going to change anytime soon. So Satan's coming in and I imagine that we probably are just being given the cliff notes of what Satan is telling Jesus. I don't know that it's really just one sentence that Jesus or that Satan says to Jesus. I think it's more along the lines of like, "Hey, you've been out here for 40 days already and nothing's happened yet. Are you really going to let yourself die and fail your mission? You know that there's more for you to do here and you're just out here and God has essentially left you to just figure it out on your own. So if you are the son of God, why don't you do something about it? You don't have to live like this. Take matters into your own hands. You should be creating bread for yourself." So again, it's putting Jesus in this spot where Satan's trying to exploit Jesus's hunger, his place of desperation to say, "Hey, just take matters into your own hands. I know you say you trust God, but doesn't it kind of look like he's left you out here to fend for yourself?" So again, Satan coming in and testing Jesus's resolve. Jesus knows he's out there to be tested. He was led by the Spirit to go out there. He didn't just go out on his own. Jesus has not taken other actions like planting traps for animals. He's not eating berries and grass. He's already not doing other things. That's very clear. And Satan's coming in and saying, "Hey, it seems like you're in a bad spot. Why don't you do something about it?" Where does it say in the Bible that you're not allowed to make bread for yourself? There's no command anywhere that says you're not allowed to go hunt, you're not allowed to do this, you're not allowed to do this. So why don't you just do something about it? I think even putting ourselves in that same situation, again, imagine being Jesus. As far as we have, as I know, we don't have any recorded miracles up to this point. You're out in the wilderness. Nobody else is around. I could see it being tempting to just be like, "I'm going to try this out. I'm going to see what happens. I know that I can do stuff like this, so I'm going to try it out and see and just see." It'd be like being out in the wilderness and there's a McDonald's up the street and it's like, "Hey, you have the power to go buy a cheeseburger. Like, why don't you just do it? Where does it say in the Bible that you're not allowed to do this?" So again, Satan coming in here and testing Jesus's trust in God, his whether or not there's any insecurity. So good examples of people that fit this mark. Individuals that panic when they get desperate. So again, we get in desperate situations in our lives, or we feel like things are going a little sideways, or things in the church are really hard because people don't like us anymore. Maybe it's I'm one of the people that likes to kind of live up in the mountains, have my own domain and control, and the government's getting just a little too overbearing on my rights and the things that I want to do. The point being, things start to feel desperate. And the temptation in that situation, if you're somebody who doesn't trust in God, the temptation is, I need to make sure that I'm good no matter what. I need to make sure that no matter what happens, I'm provided for. I need to make sure that even if the government fails, I have my underground bomb bunker that I can go retreat into with 50 years of canned food in it. And I need to make sure that I'm self-reliant, that I can make my own success, that I don't need to rely on anybody else for it. And so if you're somebody like that, that's a sign of essentially insecurity. You don't trust in God's provision, God's ability to provide. Again, going back to that church example, you think because the world doesn't like us, that must mean that something's wrong, and it makes you feel like you need to go do something about it, or you need to leave, or you need to take things into your own hands so you're not in with the crowd that you don't want to be in with. And that's all a sign of just, again, insecurity. You don't trust in God's ability to provide for us. We get in these spots where we think it's all about, I need to rely on skill and money. And think about even what Israel did in similar situations. They get brought out of Egypt. They're in the wilderness. They're in a very similar position. think about it, they go out of Egypt through the waters. 1 Corinthians 10 tells us that that was a form of baptism. They're in the wilderness now in a very desperate position. Jesus also, he goes through baptism, gets led into the wilderness to be tested. And what happens through all that is Israel, instead of saying, God brought us out here for a reason, and we are going to trust in what he told us to do, Israel instead says, this sucks, and we should get a new leader who will take us back to Egypt so that we can go back to all the good food and freedom and choices that we had. So again, Israel getting in a place of desperation where they feel like we don't have the food we want, we don't have the water we want, God's not providing for us. God must have, think about this, they say, God must have led us out here. I actually think they say this to Moses, but it's, you must have led us out here just to make us die out here. So this very insecure, untrusting position that says, we need to take things into our own hands if we want to survive. So we're going to go back to Egypt with a new leader, and we're going to get back the things that we had before. I made mention this at Young Church, but think also of the just revisionist history that's playing into practice there. They think Egypt was this great place where they had all this food availability and all these great things. But when you read the first part of Exodus, that's not exactly the picture that's painted. You have a picture of a nation in slavery who's being beaten and having things being made worse and worse. The whole reason God gets involved is because he says, I have heard the cry of my people. So you have people who are totally recasting that picture of what Egypt was. And yet still they feel so desperate on this side of it that they're like, we need to take matters into our own hands and we need to go back there. So just again, that's how you become Satan's mark, is you're insecure in that way. Another interesting thing, this pastor pointed this out to me, that, we often think that if you are not a trusting person, it's probably because you've just been burned a bunch of times in your life. That the reason that you're not a trusting person is because you've been through so many times where you did try to trust somebody and they burned you so many times, or so many different people burned you that you can't trust anybody. But the reality is it's more kind of flipped. It's more the fact that if you are an insecure person and you don't choose to trust people, again, you will be an untrusting person. And I think a good example of that is there's all sorts of people in this church that if your level of trust was tied to track record, there's a whole lot of people in this church that should trust a lot less than they do. And there's a lot of people in this church who should trust a lot more than they do. Because there's all sorts of people in the church who have been burned so many times that it's not even funny, that still continue to trust in each other and trust in God and trust in other people when they make commitments to them. And there's also all sorts of people who have hardly ever been burned in this church who don't trust other people. So again, if it was tied to track record and just whether or not you've been burned before, we would see a lot more consistency on that scale, rather than the idea of, if you are an insecure person and you choose not to trust, you obviously are an untrusting person. So if Satan can identify you as an insecure person, just understand he can devise all sorts of tests and temptations to make you feel like you need to take matters into your own hands. So think about even in relation to conformity. If you're an insecure person and what you think about when you're in a group of people from the world is, what do they think about me? And do they think I'm cool? Do they think I'm funny? Do they like being around me? If that's the way that you view those situations, that's a conformity issue. And if you're insecure, think about how tempting it is to give in just a little bit. Maybe they're talking about a movie that you know is not a good movie, but maybe you've even seen it before. Maybe you saw it before you were a Christian, and you want to fit in, so you're just like, oh man, that movie's hilarious. You've just made that little compromise right there just so that you can fit in a little bit better. And that's an example of insecurity. Think about also networks or safety nets. If you're somebody who's like, well, I have family outside the church, or I have friends outside the church, or I have friends at work or friends at school or friends, back home wherever I lived before. And you have kind of this perspective of, I'm really not going to press the gospel with them because I don't want to burn that network. I don't want to have to get to a point where I have to separate from them or where they don't like me because I'm really telling them what God says. And I don't want to do that because I want to make sure if I ever leave the church that I have somebody to go basically be my safety net. I want to know that I can have something out there that will guarantee me some level of safety or security or freedom or support if I ever leave the church. Again, that's an example of insecurity. You are insecure about really your Christian walk as a whole. You don't trust in God. You aren't willing to fully commit in that respect. So again, I think there's a lot of other examples in that, but again, that insecurity, it'll make you untrusting. It'll also make you fearful, and you don't want to be a fearful person. So super important that we patch that vulnerability. And the patch, I mean, I've essentially been saying it the whole time, but we have to trust God. That's the very simple way to put it. We also have to trust, most importantly, that if we are going to seek, or that if we will seek his kingdom and righteousness first, that he'll give us what we need. So obviously we have Matthew 4:4, Jesus answering, it's written, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God. But I think what's really cool is, I don't know why I've never done this, maybe I have, but if you've never asked, where does that quote that Jesus quotes come from? It comes from Deuteronomy 8. So if you turn back to Deuteronomy 8, I think this actually makes it that much cooler when you realize the context of what's happening in Deuteronomy 8. And just while you're turning there, so just a reminder, right? Deuteronomy, we're still talking about Moses and Israel coming out of Egypt. But at this point, enough time has passed that we're talking about the second generation, not the first generation. This is the second re-giving of the law to the second generation so that they can go into the promised land. And so Moses is basically saying, I'm going to take the proactive approach to this and give the law again to make sure you guys are on the same page, that when we go into the promised land, you're not going to screw this up like the first generation did. So if we start in verse 1, the whole commandment that I command you today, you shall be careful to do, that you may live and multiply and go in and possess the land that the Lord swore to give to your fathers. And you shall remember the whole way that the Lord your God has led you these 40 years in the wilderness, that he might humble you, testing you to know what was in your heart, whether you would keep his commandments or not. And he humbled you and let you hunger and fed you with manna, which you did not know, nor did your fathers know, that he might make you know that man does not live by bread alone, but man lives by every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. Your clothing did not wear out on you, and your foot did not swell these 40 years. Know then in your heart that as a man disciplines his son, the Lord your God disciplines you. So you shall keep the commandments of the Lord your God by walking in his ways and by fearing him. And just slowing down there. So hopefully you caught that in verse 3. That's where the quote comes from. Again, that your fathers did not know the manna, that God might make you know that man does not live by bread alone, but man lives by every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. So where I'm saying I think it's really cool is that is the connection, the whole thing we just talked about of Israel coming out of Egypt, wanting to go back there, not trusting in God to provide for them, all the way down to food and water. When they got food, then they were complaining about the kind of food that they were getting. Moses is on the mountain for too long. All sorts of these things where they're not trusting in God. That's literally the response that Jesus is giving back. Is he saying, I am out here for the same purpose, that God would test me and find out if I will obey his commandments. So I will not take matters into my own hands. I will trust in him, and I will trust that I need to live according to his commandments. Again, verse 1, the whole commandment I command you today, be careful to do it that you may live and multiply. So Jesus is saying, look, I mean, if you want to think about just Jesus's answer, it's essentially, I don't have this whole problem of thinking that I need to provide for myself or things aren't going to go the right way. Jesus does not have this level of insecurity that says, I need to define my own success. I need to make my own way in the world. Jesus is saying, look, I got no problem with this. God will provide or he won't provide. That's up to him. I trust in him, and I'm going to make sure that the things I'm doing is I'm being faithful to him, and that's what tells me if I'm successful. That's what tells me if I'm doing a good job at the end of the day. So again, super important. We need to recognize that too. God sustains us with what we need, all the way down to food, family, provision. The problem happens because we think we need it and we can't live without it. Another cool verse just to kind of round this point out. if we go back to Matthew, we'll skip actually forward a couple chapters into chapter 6. I think this is cool too, because I don't know if this is exactly what's happening, but I kind of had it in my head that Jesus undergoes this temptation. He comes out of the wilderness, and then he goes up and Sermon on the Mount, his first public sermon. Almost this idea of like, Jesus is like, look, I learned a thing or two in the wilderness. And I don't think that's the whole sermon, but I do think that there's probably a piece of it that's tied to this, where I'm going in chapter 6. So in chapter 6, if we look at verse 24, and if nothing else, this at least tells you Jesus's mindset about it that probably made him successful. So verse 24, no one can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money. Therefore, I tell you, do not be anxious about your life, what you will eat or what you will drink, nor about your body, what you will put on. Is not life more than food, and the body more than clothing? Look at the birds of the air. They neither sow nor reap nor gather into barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not of more value than they? And which of you, by being anxious, can add a single hour to his span of life? Why are you anxious about clothing? Consider the lilies of the field, how they grow. They neither toil nor spin. Yet I tell you, even Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like one of these. But if God so clothes the grass of the field, which today is alive and tomorrow is thrown into the oven, will he not much more clothe you, O you of little faith? Therefore, do not be anxious, saying, what shall we eat, or what shall we drink, or what shall we wear? For the Gentiles seek after all these things, and your heavenly Father knows that you need them all. But seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you. Therefore, do not be anxious about tomorrow, for tomorrow will be anxious for itself, and sufficient for the day is its own trouble. So think about that in the context of what Jesus underwent. You have, at the very least, a picture into the way that Jesus was thinking about this, and therefore the right perspective for us to have about the same kinds of things. Think about even back in Deuteronomy 8, he says, your fathers were fed with the manna. We're not told explicitly there, but God also providing water for them. And then he also brings up the fact that your shoes didn't wear out, your feet didn't swell up. So the same three things that are getting brought up here, food, drink, and your clothing. And Jesus is like, look, God knows you need all these things. And if you'll just trust him, and if you'll seek him first, his kingdom, his righteousness first, all those things will be provided. But think again of verse 24. You can't serve two masters. God is putting us in a position where he's giving us power to go make wealth and go do good things. But at the end of the day, we can't become so reliant on money and the security that gives us that we forget about God. And I meant to actually read that in Deuteronomy 8, but if you were to keep going through those verses, that's exactly what Moses brings up, is he says, look, you better be super careful that you don't forget about this. You better make sure that you continue to obey what God says, because you're about to go into a land that has all sorts of food and available things, and you guys are going to be super blessed because you're going to have flocks and food and money and security, and there's all sorts of good things coming your way. And he says, beware lest you get into that position and you say, it's by my power that I've been able to generate and get these things. So Moses making the same point of, no matter how good things get in life, you have to take yourself back to a position of, what ultimately puts my head on the pillow at night? Or at least when I put my head on the pillow, I can do so peacefully. And that better come back to the fact that you are righteous and you're seeking God's kingdom first, and that you trust in him to provide, not the fact that you have a really nice house and a huge salary and that everything's going great in your life. That's not what should determine success for you. So again, super important. If you're somebody who believes and defines your life on faithfulness and God's promises, you will not be an insecure person. All the way back to those conformity situations. If that's your focus, is all I need to worry about in this situation is not whether other people like me. All I need to worry about is God happy with me at the end of this situation or not? And if that's your focus, you're not insecure. You don't have a problem when you say stuff and other people frown at you or don't like you or laugh at you or make fun of it. You don't have a problem with any of that. You're not insecure because you know that's not what's going to put your head on the pillow and make you feel good at the end of the day. And that's the Matthew, just again, continuing on, think about the end of Matthew 7. at the end of the Sermon on the Mount. Think about how Jesus ends that out in verse 24. Everyone who hears these words of mine and does them will be like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain fell and the floods came and the winds blew and beat on the house, but it did not fall because it had been founded on the rock. And everyone who hears these words of mine and does not do them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. And the rain fell and the floods came and the winds blew and beat against that house and it fell, and great was the fall of it. So understand Jesus' point closing that out. He's saying, look, you really got two options in front of you. You can believe what I say, which is if you'll focus your life in this direction, things will be super good. Nothing will be able to move you, even if things get super bad. But on the flip side, if you decide I'm going to run off and my whole life, the success of my life is going to be determined on how big my house is, how much money I make, the fact that I have a 401k that can take me through 25 years of retirement at, $100,000 a year. I don't know what a realistic number is these days, but I'm trying to make the point of, if you put your investment and your focus on those kinds of things where you say, I'm going to make sure that even if God fails and even if the church fails and even if everybody else fails, that I'm still taken care of, well, then you're building your house on the sand. And if you're good with that, then I guess good luck. But that's Jesus's point, is we're not to do that. We're not to live that way. So again, insecurity, important area of our life to make sure we have shored up. Moving on to area number 5. Another place Satan's looking to take advantage of is your lack of ownership. So your lack of ownership. So back here to chapter 4, you should still be in Matthew here. Pick up in verse 5. It says, then the devil took him to the holy city and set him on the pinnacle of the temple and said to him, if you are the Son of God, throw yourself down, for it is written, he will command his angels concerning you, and on their hands they will bear you up, lest you strike your foot against a stone. And Jesus said to him, again, it is written, you shall not put the Lord your God to the test. So this one's pretty interesting. I'm sure, lack of ownership, I don't think jumps out right away when you read these verses. But the first interesting thing to call out is just, again, Satan is quoting scripture. So that's important to pick up on for two reasons. One, it should tell you that just because somebody quotes scripture does not make them right, or doesn't mean they're using it the right way. But two is just, that definitely makes it more convincing when people do that. And so we need to be careful in that respect. And we need to keep that in mind, that Jesus is hearing something that Satan's like, look, this is said about you. So why don't you test this? Why don't you see if that's true? And we have to remember, again, Jesus, though fully God, he's coming to earth and becoming fully man. He's in a position of, he's experiencing a lot of this for the first time still. And he's in a position of, hey, there's scripture written about you. There's prophecy written about you. Why don't you test that and show whether that's really true or not? And again, now think about it from a perspective of, Satan is basically like, if you're, okay, so you didn't want to do the whole stone thing. You're saying you trust in God too much for that. You're not worried. If you trust in God so much, jump off the temple. Why don't you show me that God's really going to provide? Why don't you show me that he's really going to come through? And imagine being in that situation, and I could see, knowing it's Satan, just being like, I am super irritated at you, and I'm going to prove a point right here. Really, you're going to keep on pressing this issue? Even imagine your hangry level, right? You've been without food for 40 days. So you're in this position of like, I don't have to put up with this. I don't have to sit here and let Satan be like, oh, if you're really the Son of God, why don't you jump off the temple? Why don't you do something about it? Why don't you prove it to me? If you prove it, I'll go away. I'll shut my mouth. I'll stop bothering everybody. If you'll just do this one thing for me, just show me. And Jesus picks up on what's happening here and says, obviously, the whole, you are not to put the Lord your God to the test. So what is Satan ultimately doing? Well, he's testing Jesus's attention to detail, discernment, his patience. Again, attention to detail. Jesus needs to be sharp enough to pick up on what's happening here. Satan is trying to put him in a position that ultimately would be a test of God, because we test God when we do things and put God in a position of, God, you better come through for me, or you're not real, or I don't trust in you, or you didn't do what you were required to do. You didn't uphold your end of the promise. That's testing God when we put God in that kind of situation. So maybe it's even I buy a house that the mortgage is way too expensive for my current budget. And I'm just like, well, I trust in God. He will come through for me. My salary, because I got this new house, will raise commensurate to whatever my new need is. This can even be in situations like we know of this happening where I really like that church building over there, and it's way too big for me to afford. But if I just buy it, I know God's going to come through. He will fill it with people so that I can afford it. And the next thing you know, you're asking other people to help you pay for the building instead. But that's testing God. That's putting God in a position where it says, hey, God, I'm going to do this action because I want to do this action. And if you're really God, you're going to come through for me. You're going to show me that you're at work here. You're going to show me that I'm really one of your people, that I am really as precious as you say I am. Because I want this thing, you're going to show me that you're God by doing that. So that's, again, what Satan is testing here is Jesus going to pick up on this? Or is Jesus going to be like, this isn't that big of a deal, and I can shut this guy up for good by just doing this really quick. Scripture says that this is going to be true, so I should just do it. Again, that's not the position we want to be in. Satan's looking for that lack of ownership on Jesus's part, that Jesus is going to make a decision without taking ownership of what those implications are, what the consequences of doing that would be. That Jesus is just going to do it without thinking. Those are all issues where ownership's not being taken because you just do something without thinking about it. You don't own whether or not that's successful or not successful. You don't own the fact that you need to make that kind of decision. And that's what Satan is hoping for. And again, keep that in mind. He's taking him from one extreme to the other. He's like, all right, you're saying, I tried to get you to not trust in God and just do it yourself. And that didn't work. So let's try the other side of that. You say you trust in God. How much do you trust in God? Jump off the temple and prove it. So how do we become the mark in this respect? Well, I've kind of already alluded to this, but you live your life and you make decisions, and those, or rather how you live your life and how you make decisions, reflects very little to no deep thought about the implications or consequences of it. Your passivity, lack of effort, and lack of discernment and lack of thought mean that you cruise through life without mitigating, much less even thinking or catching onto the unnecessary risks in your life. So again, you move through life and you just kind of react to stuff. You just do stuff when it comes up. And you don't really think a whole lot about whether or not that's actually good or what kind of position or what the implications of that might be, what the consequences could be. You're willing to buy a house and just, it's like, I love how that house looks and I'm willing to live with whatever else would come along with getting it. That's the kind of just laziness, lack of effort that says, I'm going to make this decision and I honestly don't care about what else might happen as a result of it. Again, that's a super lazy approach. And oftentimes you'll be putting God to the test. You either put yourself in risky situations because you don't think of God, or again, you put yourself in risky situations and just assume that God will come through for you. So even another example is maybe you're super beat and tired and you're like, I'm going to take a vacation. I know I can't afford a vacation, but God knows how tired I am. He knows I could use a break, so I'm going to do it. I'll put it on a credit card and I will figure the rest out later. That is you not taking ownership. That's a lazy river approach to life of just, I will do what works now and I will figure the rest out later. Or again, even worse, I'm going to do this thing now. I'm going to go on vacation and I'm just going to assume that God's going to drop a bonus in my life. I'm going to show up to work on Monday and my boss is going to be like, hey, great news. That vacation that's coming up, turns out the company actually wants to pay for everybody to go on vacation. And you're like, oh, sweet. God really came through for me. Rather than living and say, no, I need to make sure that whatever choices I make are responsible, that I don't ever put God in a situation where God has to come through for me in order for me to trust him or be faithful to him. So again, a super important area for us to reflect on and make sure that that's not true. I would also say that if you're always taking the back seat and letting others dictate your schedule and your plans and your preferences and the things you do and the things you say and the way you live your life, if that's always based on who you're around and what other people say, that's another major area of you don't own anything in your life. You are a slave to other people's thoughts about how the world is. And it doesn't necessarily mean that they're in the wrong, But think about this is if you're trusting everybody else, you have this moment of, hey, I don't think that's right for us to do that. That movie, I thought that was a bad movie. That TV show, I didn't really think we should be watching that. And all it takes is for someone else to be like, no, I've done the research. It's totally fine. Or, well, I know that, pastors watched it, or I talked to pastor about it. He said it was fine. Or, I talked to Kevin and he said it was good. Any example of that, if you don't take the kind of ownership and say like, okay, that's great. I mean, that's a piece of information, but I need to now hear why that's the case. And I need to make sure that I am super confident in making that decision. Again, you don't own those decisions at all. You're just letting other people dictate your life. So again, that's another example of how you can become Satan's mark. And why that's a problem is, think about even with Jesus or with yourself. If Satan can pick up on this, if he can pick up on you don't take ownership of these kinds of decisions, that means you live a very risky life, which means you are the perfect mark for Satan to bring all sorts of risky situations into your life. And he is just hoping that you don't pick up on the fact that you constantly are testing God or constantly putting yourself in bad situations. It's all the unmitigated risk that you didn't even know was risky. You think life is a lazy river and everything is safe, and it's more like you're floating down an inner tube towards a waterfall. There's all sorts of danger all over the place, and you're acting like there's nothing to be worried about. So again, Satan, if he can pick up on that, if he can identify that that's in your life, man, that's super easy for him. All he has to do is put you in enough risky situations over and over and over and over and over again, and eventually you will do something that causes serious consequences. Even all the way back to the Israelites, we talked about this at Young Church as well with 1 Corinthians 10. Paul makes the point there that the Israelites came out and they had all of the advantages stacked in their favor. They were baptized. They ate of the Lord's table in the wilderness. There's all these great things. And yet still in the end, God was not pleased with most of them. I mean, there's very few people that come out of that first generation that God's actually good with by the end of the story. And the point that Paul makes is they were focused on all these wrong things and just floating along, just reacting to everything. They weren't taking the kind of ownership that they needed to. And eventually what he says is they put themselves in situations where that ends up in idolatry, sexual immorality, and ultimately apostasy. And we don't want to become those types of people. So then how we patch that vulnerability is just that we need to take that kind of extreme ownership necessary to be confident that we're not testing God in any of the choices that we make. Think about even the principle of faithful in little, faithful in much. That's what Jesus says is if you are faithful in the little, you will be faithful in the much. Well, that takes you starting with the little. You need to take that kind of extreme ownership and action in these little areas. And if you don't do it there, you should never expect that you will be successful when it comes to big things. Or that when big tests or big risky situations, you think I can hold on to this little area because it's not that big of a deal. But yeah, if it was ever in this really big category, I would obviously recognize that that was risky. No, it's the other way around. If you can recognize it back here, you'll pick up on it over here. If you don't do it over here, there's a very low chance of you doing it over here. So super important. And also just, again, think about the position that Jesus is in back in Matthew 4. It's this whole, I can prove right now to Satan and to a lot of people, I'm sure there were people around the temple, I can prove to a lot of people that I am the Son of God by doing this great, amazing miracle. And all I have to do is just jump and just go for it. But understand, you're on God's time, not yours. You don't get to define when things happen. Just, again, the whole vacation idea. You don't get to define, I'm going to take vacation right now, God will come through for me. You don't get to be somebody who's like, I do think that maybe I should do this thing, but I'm waiting for a sign from God for that to happen. And if God doesn't show me a sign, then I'm not going to go through with it. You don't get to dictate those kinds of terms with God. That's not the arrangement. So again, we have to take that kind of time to think of and mitigate the risks ahead of time. We won't turn to it for sake of time, but back again, like I said, where does what Jesus says comes from? Sorry, that was a jumble of a sentence, but in verse 7, when he says, you shall not put the Lord your God to the test, where does that come from? That also comes from Deuteronomy, this time in chapter 6, verse 16. And again, Moses saying, like, you shall not put God to the test. like your fathers did in the wilderness. And if you find the cross reference, it's Exodus 17, verse 3. And they've already started to have manna pour out of heaven. God, by this point, has also parted the Red Sea for them to go through. So you would think that there would be some level of confidence in like, yeah, I think God can probably come through on this. And that I don't need to, test him and say, if he doesn't come through on this, that means he's not real or he's not going to come through. But again, in 17:3, they test him by saying, essentially, God needs to provide us water. And if you look at verses 6 and 7, God's super mad at them because they're saying God needs to provide water. And then when that doesn't happen on their time frame, they're basically saying, is the Lord really among us? So that's the kind of testing, is God needs to provide us or we won't believe that he's there. Even after all these other things have happened, if this thing doesn't happen right now for me, right now, I won't believe he's there. We see that throughout Jesus's ministry too, where there's all these supernatural miracles that he practices, and he still gets towards the end of the ministry and they're like, hey, if you really are the Son of God, why don't you show us a sign? And I'm sure that he was frustrated by that point of being like, how many other signs do you guys need before you would believe? Hence why he's like, you guys aren't getting any sign except the sign of Jonah, which is you better repent because the kingdom of God's coming. You know it's coming, and you're not going to get anything more than that. So again, we need to make sure that we are careful in that respect, that we do change our lives to take ownership of those decisions. Our sixth and final area that comes out of these verses is that Satan will also target your fickleness. So your fickleness. Kind of a funny word, but fickle is a really, really good word for what we're talking about. The simple Google definition was changing frequently, especially as it regards your loyalties, your interests, or your affection. So it's honestly a really good term for what we see in chapter 4. Again, we should still be in Matthew, but chapter 4, verse 8, the final temptation here. Again, the devil took him to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their glory. And he said to them, all these I will give you if you will fall down and worship me. Then Jesus said to him, begone, Satan, for it is written, you shall worship the Lord your God, and him only shall you serve. So think about, again, the position that Jesus is being put in. And I think this was another one for me where I was like, well, obviously Jesus is not going to bow down and worship Satan. But I think you have to think way more about what's being offered to Jesus than the simple fact of worshiping Satan. Because people do this all the time. We're not talking about you bow down to a pentagram. We're just talking about that idea of you sell your soul for the world. And that's what's happening here is Satan's coming in and testing Jesus's commitment to the mission versus the appeal of the world. So think about, again, you're Jesus and you've made it to earth, you become an adult, and you know what's on the horizon for you. Think about how even if you have all the knowledge in the world, if you have emotions in the way, you can totally be in a position that's just like, I don't care about any of the correct, accurate information. I just want to make this decision over here because it's more comfortable. And we can all be super susceptible to that, where someone can be like, but do you not understand that if you do that, this is what's going to happen? If you do that, this is what's going to be true. If you do that, this is the consequence of that. If your emotions are stoked enough in the wrong direction, you can totally just be like, I just don't care. I'm sorry, but I want to do this thing because that's more comfortable right now. So you're Jesus. And even though you have all the knowledge of a perfect God, you're also in the position of being stuck in the same human bodies that we are. And you know that you are going to undergo an incredibly terrible, torturous death. On top of the fact that the next, however many years of his life are going to be marked by super unpopularity. People are going to hate him. People are not going to like him. They're going to say bad things about him. They're going to plot against him. He's going to be incredibly unpopular and live a very rough lifestyle, all the way up to the point where he's going to get taken to the cross and tortured and killed very, very, very slowly. So you're in that position and you're on the front end of your ministry. And here's somebody coming into the picture and saying, you don't have to do any of that at all. And not just you can get out of it, but I will help you and get you everything you could ever desire. You want to do this mission so that you're obedient to God and do what he wants you to do, that you would have a kingdom and kingship, and that God would give to you the place of truly being the son who rules over the world. You want to do all that. I can get you that without any of the discomfort, any of the pain, any of the bad stuff. Let me show you what the world has to offer. Imagine Satan being able to take you on a road trip and saying, I have control over all this stuff, and I'm going to show you the best parts of it. And I can promise you right now, if you'll just stop following God, I'll give you all of it. Control over all of it. The most, you will be the richest person, the most powerful person. You will be second only to me in the world. I already rule the world, and I can make you my number two. And again, that's what's being held up next to the idea of you go through with this mission, everybody's going to hate you. Nobody's going to like you. And you're going to go through this super terrible, unbearable death. Again, how many people, even in our day, would make that kind of decision? If you took it even just outside of the context of truly like Satan and God, you just said, hey, if you go with that guy, here's what that means. It's going to be super hard, and you're going to die in a very short period of time, and it's going to be a very painful death. Or you can come with me, and I will give you more than you could ever imagine. I mean, how many people would make that kind of exchange? So again, I don't mean to belabor that point, but that's what Satan's doing, is testing that level of commitment in Jesus. He wants to see something in Jesus that wants to maximize freedom of choice and experience and enjoyment in this life, and an attitude that does not want to commit. Again, he's testing Jesus and saying, are you sure you want to go through with that mission? Because I can give you a really, really nice alternative. And how we become that is a lot of people already do this. You live life hooked on American culture. And when Pastor and I were talking through this point, it's truly the new age problem of, hey, you don't have to say no to anything. There is so much available at our fingertips from food, entertainment, information, knowledge, anything you could want. And the super dangerous thing about the generation we live in is it's being preached all the time that you don't have to give up anything. You don't have to take options off the table ever. You didn't go to school when you were young, go to school when you were older. You didn't go to a good college when you were young. You can go to this college over here, and maybe you don't even have to go back to school. They'll just recognize your work experience. And I'm not saying that is inherently bad. I'm just saying that there's all sorts of options that people didn't always have. Even with cars, I mean, you don't have to walk into a dealership and have all the money to actually pay for a car. You can just be like, hey, I got $1,000 a month that I can put towards a car. You can get a pretty nice car for that. And you don't have to have a huge stack of cash to make that happen. Same thing with houses. We can live in houses that we can't necessarily afford. And again, all the way back to food, if you're in a position where it's the whole, you can't have your cake and eat it too, in our world, you can. If you want to try multiple different things, you want cake and ice cream, you can have cake and ice cream. You don't have to say no. And again, the dangerous thing with that is, even though none of us would say that that's actually true, that there's never options off the table, it feels true enough times that we can almost start to believe like it should always be true. And so that's, again, what Satan is looking for, is just that we're people who really don't want to say no. We really don't want to commit to a path that would take something else off the table. And we think by not committing to things that that's somehow a more that it keeps more options on the table. But I think that's even another call out, is if you won't commit to something, you're also committing on the other side to whatever consequences come from not committing. But it feels better because you don't actually have to make a decision. This is back to the whole ownership piece. It feels better to not make a decision because at least it seems like even if that option's off the table, it's not my fault. But understand, again, this fickleness problem. We have this idea of, I shouldn't have to ever say no. That's why when we see other people and they get a nice car, they get a nice house, or they have, a dog or a cat or a kid or anything, it's like, why don't I have one of those? And you know what? In America, that's a good question. Why don't you have one? You can. There's nothing preventing you from it. 99% of the time, there's nothing preventing you from a lot of those things. So we live in that kind of culture that says you don't have to commit and take choices off the table. You can just maximize all of them. And again, that's what Satan's looking for. He wants you to be covetous that way, to say, hey, I see what this person has over here, and I really, really want that, so I'm going to do what it takes to get it. And again, like I said, we're not talking about truly needing to bow down and worship Satan, just the idea of selling your soul for the world. A couple verses that are good examples of this, the whole idea of, I don't want to choose one, I just want everything. Deuteronomy 17, 16, and 17, God's actually giving prescription, or there's prescription rather in the law for if Israel ever wants to raise up a king. And what God calls out, because he knows that this propensity and possibility is there, is God says, you can have a king, but that king, whoever he is, here's a couple things that he better be super careful of. He better not take a bunch of wives, and he better not get super rich, because God knows that that is a recipe for disaster. When you put yourself in a position where you don't have to say no to anything, you are ripe for these kinds of attacks. And what happens? Think of King Solomon. King Solomon's put in a position by David where he really doesn't have to work for hardly anything that he got. He's pretty much the trust fund kid of Israel's kings, where David passes on a very good kingship to him. And what happens with Solomon is he makes Israel great. It's incredible. I mean, the amount of riches and affluency that are in Israel during Solomon's day is ridiculous. But the thing that Solomon also does is he gets used to this whole, I don't have to say no to anything. It literally says that he has 700 wives and 300 concubines. So that's 1,000 women I was about to say keeping track of. I don't know that he was probably even to that level. But the point is, that's a king who does not ever practice saying no to things. He's just like, why should I? What reason would there be for me to do that? I don't need to commit to anything. I want this wife this day and this one the next day. And I see somebody over there who's not my wife, and I'm going to make her my wife because I also want her. And if you live your life that way, where everything you see is just, I want that and I'm going to get it. And I want that and I'm going to get it. And you never say no to anything. You're that kind of person. And what Solomon eventually does is he compromises. He makes those kinds of compromises and eventually ends up going astray with them and worshiping their gods. So don't think that this is some innocent category that you can just say yes to any and every option that's in your life. You need to make those kinds of decisions. Even the rich young ruler in Matthew 19, thing, right? You have somebody who's mostly faithful, and Jesus is like, hey, man, you can't come follow me if you're going to hold on to your riches the way that you are. And that guy goes away, and he's like, I'm not willing to give that up. I don't want to say no to it. And when Satan finds this in you, he knows that, man, he can just dangle all the shiny things of the world in front of your face, and you will be like I don't even have a good analogy for it, but the point is, like, you will give into those things. You will be super susceptible to that. All he has to do is show you all the shiny stuff out in the world, and you'll go right off for it. And I think the sad thing about that too is, if you make a decision that's like that, where you leave the faith because you want the things of the world, you are committing to something. You are taking options off the table, and you are also choosing to believe that it's going to be just as nice out there as you think it's going to be. Because understand, when Satan gets you out of the church, he doesn't really have much incentive to help you anymore. He doesn't need to deliver on any of the promises that he made on this side of the game. You can get out there and he can just leave you if you serve no further purpose. So you may get out there and find that things are a lot harder out there than you thought they were going to be. And that's not trying to put some fear trip there, but it's more trying to make the point of, you make that kind of decision, you're susceptible in this way. Satan's going to try to target that. And ironically, if you bite the bait that's right there, you are making a commitment. You are committing to something. You will take options off the table. And the things that you leave the church for may not even come through for you. And ironically, I think we've seen that people will leave the faith, and it's not like they become these traveling movie stars, rock stars, NBA players. They fulfill all the dreams that they could ever have imagined. It's like they go out and live basically the same life that we're all living, with respect to like the I got a career, I got a family, I got a house, I got a dog, I got this. There's nothing like super special about it. It's not like they go on to become nuclear scientists that move international and have this incredible Nobel Peace Prize winning career. It's just pretty normal. So again, the point is, when Satan finds that in you, though, he can dangle those things and make it look super enticing. So how do we patch that? We're almost through the end here. So pretty simple. I mean, put your hand to the plow and don't look back. That's the way that at least Jesus answers it. You have to cut off those options. Notice what Jesus says to him in verse 10. He says, "Be gone, Satan, for it is written, you shall worship the Lord your God, and him only shall you serve." Again, that does also, by the way, go back to Deuteronomy. But Jesus is picking up on it where he's like, nope, that's not going to work for me. I'm going to cut off those options. I'm not even going to entertain that. We see this in Luke 9:52 or 62 rather. Jesus says, anyone who puts his hand to the plow and looks back is not fit for the kingdom of God. We also see it in Matthew 10:37 and 39 or through 39. That's where Jesus says, hey, if you are not willing to leave behind father and mother and lose your life for my sake, you are not worthy of me. You need to make a commitment. You need to put your hand to the plow. You need to move in a certain direction. I think a couple just verses that I do want to turn to, if we flip over to Matthew 16, I think this is super interesting. Again, think of Satan's coming in and he's like, hey, Jesus, you don't have to die. I'll give you all the stuff that you could ever want. We flip forward to Matthew 16, and what happens in verse 21? It says, from that time, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed and on the third day be raised. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, far be it from you, Lord, this shall never happen to you. But he turned and said to Peter, get behind me, Satan, you are a hindrance to me, for you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man. I think it's really interesting that he chooses in that moment to call Peter Satan, because Peter in that moment is doing the same thing that Satan is, testing Jesus's commitment to the mission, saying, you don't have to die. You're saying that all these horrible things are going to happen, and I'll keep them from happening to you, just like Satan did. And Jesus responds to that and is like, you better get behind me and get out of the way. That is very much cut off options language. And that's, I think, how we should think about it is you need to cut off those options. You don't even entertain them as options. And you should have a violent response resisting those kinds of options. You need to learn to say no, and you need to practice that even in areas where you don't need to practice that, so that when these options are on the table, you don't even think of it that way. That's even if we jump over just a couple more chapters here to chapter 18. Notice the way that Jesus chooses to say it. He says in verse 8, if your hand or your foot causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. And then verse 9, if your eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. It's better for you to enter life with one eye than with two eyes to be thrown into the hell of fire. And I think the sad thing is, I think we read a lot of these verses in the kind of weak voices in our own head sometimes, rather than appreciating probably the oomph behind what Jesus is saying here and the gravity he's putting on it. Again, it's this point of like, hey, look, there are a lot of options out there. And if you even entertain those things, you're already on the right track. You better have this violent attitude of resistance, and I will not give into those things that would get in the way of the mission if you're going to be successful. So super important. Again, this picks up on even that principle of if you're not faithful in the little, you won't be faithful in much. If you don't even manage these little things down here, God is certainly not going to help you get more things if you're already irresponsible and already covetous of other things. If you have a little bit down here and everything in your life is just like, I want more and I just wish that there was more. I think, I can't remember maybe Warren Buffett. I think there's literally a quote from him that's, how much money is enough? And his response to that was just a little bit more. One of the richest guys ever. And you have that kind of perspective, because that's the problem, is if you have a life that's focused on, I need to maximize everything, then nothing will ever be enough for you. So again, super important to know about ourselves. Another piece is, again, just committing to nothing is committing to something. We have that, again, idea that somehow by not committing to things that we're keeping options on the table. But the reality is, if you're not going to do this over here, for example, you're not going to follow Christ, you're not going to commit yourself fully over here, you do take options off the table. You do commit to something. You commit to being good with whatever consequences come because you didn't do this over here. So you can't get away with that excuse. Moving into just conclusion here. I think a few things that are a little bit more on, let's say, the encouraging side is James 4, 7, and 8 says something pretty cool. So this is one half of it. James 4, 7, and 8, he says, "Submit yourselves therefore to God, resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. Cleanse your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded." So I thought this was really cool just from the standpoint of resist the devil, and he will flee from you. You have power in this situation. It's not that you have to just constantly be under a barrage of attack from Satan. But I think one other really interesting thing is Luke 4:13, and you don't even necessarily have to turn there. I'll read it. This is the other account of Satan's temptation of Jesus. But pretty interesting what it says in verse 13. It says, "When the devil had ended every temptation, he departed from him until an opportune time." And I think that piece is really interesting because I think it says, again, resist the devil and he will flee from you. But understand that the devil is always watching. He is always looking for another opportune time. So said another way, we should always live in a constant state of vigilance against Satan, but we do not have to live under constant attack from Satan. And last piece, I was thinking about this right before I came up here. God's also using all of this to make us better and to make us what he wants us to be. That's the same thing with Job. God's using Satan, allowing those things to happen to strengthen Job and make him that much better. Even with Jesus, he learned, sorry, I'm not going to quote the verse right, so I won't even go there. But even with Jesus, you have a test that is commensurate to who Jesus was. Jesus was the perfect human. He was the Son of God. Jesus's test, therefore, was unbelievably difficult because if he failed even at one point in his life, he failed the test. But understand what that also means about all of us is we should expect that Jesus had the hardest test ever because of that reason. He was essentially the ultimate human being. And so therefore his test was even that much more challenging. But for all of us, we should take encouragement at the same time that anything we're being put through from a testing standpoint is made for us. And that should be encouraging because it means that if you're sitting there thinking, this is way too hard or this is super challenging or I don't know if I can do this, just know that that's all in your own head. God does know that you can do it. You can make it through if you'll just push through. So closing contemplation, just to close our time out. This kind of builds on that distinction I made at the beginning, but we've talked about the areas that Satan may attempt to target. But think now about what methods he may try to use to exploit your areas of weakness. So again, maybe you have a fickleness problem. What things is he bringing into your life to try to exploit that? That's what I'm getting at here. And the contemplation there is, are you under attack right now? And what are you going to do to fight back? So let's close out. Father, thank you for giving us time to be in your word. We thank you for just everything that you give us. We all the way down to a faithful pastor that does this as a full-time job. And I think it's easy to appreciate that when people fill in, just the caliber and level that he's able to present your word and the clarity that it brings. And we thank you for a faithful man in that respect, and just pray that our lives would be reflective of a commitment to become better and better for you. And we thank you for the equipping that comes through your word to do just that. So Father, as we go out of this place and into the world again, just pray and ask that your spirit would continue to fill us, that we would be all the more helped and strengthened to understand your word and to live holy lives that are honoring to you. And we lift all of this up in your son's name. Amen.
God's people, please stand. In obedience to Numbers 6, I now bless you with these words. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. And all of God's people receive that blessing by swearing. All for Jesus. Have a great week.